The sun hung low, spilling a molten light across the wood-plank platform, each board weathered and warped by years of boots and storms. The train had gone minutes ago, leaving behind a hush broken only by the dry creak of the sign overhead and the far-off clop of a single horse. Dust swirled lazily in the cooling air, catching the last gold of the day like fireflies that had lost their way. She stood alone by a battered trunk, her hands folded before her bonnet askew from the wind's rude hand. The dress she wore might have once been pretty, cream cotton with a faded ribbon at the waist, but the journey had wrinkled it, and the station's long shadow made it look duller still. She had been told someone would be here. Someone to claim her. That was the word the woman on the train had used, with a pitying tilt to her head. Claim. But no one had stepped forward when she disembarked. Just the station master, shifting on his heels, and two women from town whispering behind their gloves. The whispers carried, sharp in the stillness, their syllables slicing through her ribs. Her eyes scanned the dusty road leading into town. Nothing moved there, not even a stray dog. A gust tugged at her skirt, lifting the hem to show the faint outline of her ankles, and she pressed it down quickly. The platform smelled of creosote and sun-baked earth, and beneath that, the faint sourness of cattle penned somewhere nearby. She had been standing there for near half an hour, long enough for her hope to fray. The station master cleared his throat, avoided her eyes, and retreated inside as if to spare himself the sight of her. She bit the inside of her cheek. The last thing she wanted was to cry where they could see. The whispering women did not leave. One was tall and thin, with hair pulled into a severe knot. The other was younger, her cheeks too pink from rouge. Their voices lowered, but she caught words all the same. No family, no dowry, trouble follows, until her ears burned. She turned her face toward the hills, willing the sound of them away. It was then she noticed the shadow. At first, she thought it belonged to the platform post. But the post did not move, and this shadow shifted, stretching across the boards as a figure approached from the far end of the station yard. He came without hurry, each step measured, his shoulders broad as the horizon. He wore no shirt, only a pair of worn buckskin trousers that clung to the line of his hips. A leather strap bound his dark hair back, the rest falling loose to touch the nape of his neck. The light caught the planes of his chest, scarred, sun-browned, the kind of strength that did not come from vanity, but from a life of lifting, carrying, enduring. There was no swagger in him, no need to announce himself. The space around him seemed to still of its own accord. He stopped a few paces from her. His gaze swept her face once, steady, unreadable, and then dropped to the battered trunk at her side. "You need a home," he said, voice low, shaped by an accent not of this town. "And I need a woman." The words landed heavy in the space between them. They were not a question, not a plea, just a fact, laid plain in the dying light. Her fingers tightened on the handle of her bag. She felt the heat of the women's stares from behind, sharp as nettles. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes on him. "Why?" she asked, the words sounding smaller than she meant. He did not flinch, did not smile. "Why not?" The question hung there, strange and unanswerable. She searched his face for cruelty and found only patience, as if he could stand there until the wind itself changed. Her heart beat a little faster. She had known men who talked too much, who promised heaven while their hands reached for things they hadn't earned. This one offered nothing but shelter, and the truth, if it was truth, was stripped of ornament. That made it harder to refuse. He nodded once toward the road beyond the tracks. "Come." Her gaze flicked to the empty horizon, then back to him. "I don't know you." "You will," he said simply. Behind her, the tall woman sked. The younger one muttered something about shame. Heat rose to her cheeks, but it was not the same heat as before. It was a kind that burned cleaner. She bent to lift her bag. His hand was there first, closing around the worn handle. The bag looked small in his grasp. He carried it as though it weighed nothing, turned toward the road without looking to see if she followed. And maybe it was that, his assumption that she would, that made her take the first step. Then another. The sound of the town faded quickly. The dirt road opened into low hills, where the grass bent in the cool wind, and the air smelled faintly of sage. She walked a few paces behind him, watching the easy sway of his stride, the way he seemed to notice every sound, the call of a hawk, the rustle in the grass. When they reached a small rise, he paused, glancing back at her. "You walk slow." She straightened, tightening her grip on her skirt. "I walk careful." He said nothing more, but the corner of his mouth might have softened for half a heartbeat before he turned again. A wagon waited in the shade of a cottonwood, the horses shifting lazily. He set her bag in the back, then held out a hand, not as a courtly gesture, but to help her step up. His palm was rough, warm, the kind of hand that could hold a thing steady in a storm. She took it. They rode in silence. The sun slid lower, the shadows lengthened. She kept her eyes on the horizon, on the place where the land seemed to go on forever. Part of her wanted to ask where he lived, what he meant to do with her. Part of her did not want to know yet. Once, the wagon hit a rut, and she reached for the side to steady herself. He glanced at her, then shifted a folded blanket from behind the seat and placed it beside her. She murmured a thank you without looking his way. He gave no sign of hearing, but the corner of the blanket brushed her leg when the wind shifted, and the weight of it there felt more solid than any promise. They crossed a shallow stream, the horses' hooves stirring the water to silver in the twilight. She watched the ripples fade behind them and thought of the station. The empty platform, the whispering women, the sun sinking without ceremony. Up ahead, the road curved out of sight. He guided the horses with one hand, the reins loose, his posture easy but watchful. The light touched his profile, and in it she saw not softness, but something older, endurance carved deep as the lines on the land. She realized then that she had already left more than the station behind. The air grew cooler as the sky deepened to indigo. Somewhere, a coyote called, thin and lonely. She drew the blanket tighter, and in the quiet that followed, she heard the sound of his breath, steady, untroubled, as if he knew exactly where they were going, and that was enough. She did not. Not yet. But her feet were no longer on the station boards, and the voices were far behind. And for the first time in months, maybe years, she wondered if the road ahead might hold something more than loss. The wagon crested another rise, and the land beyond lay in shadow. He slowed the horses, eyes fixed on something unseen. Without looking at her, he said, "We're almost there." It was not the words that made her pulse quicken, but the way he said we, as though it had always been so. The wagon moved at a steady, unhurried pace, wheels groaning against the ruts as the horses flicked their ears at the flies. The road unspooled before them in pale dust, stretching through grasslands that rolled out toward a far line of blue hills. The air carried a coolness now, the heat of the day lifting into the open sky, leaving only the faint smell of sun-warmed earth and dry sage. She sat on the wooden seat, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed ahead. Beside her, he held the reins loosely, guiding the team with the quiet assurance of someone who had traveled these roads so often they'd become part of his own bones. He hadn't spoken since they left the station, and the silence between them was a weight she wasn't sure how to name. Neither hostile nor kind, just present, like the hum of the wheels beneath them. Once, she glanced sideways. The light caught along the ridges of his shoulders, the dark braid at his back shifting with the motion of the wagon. Scars marked his forearms, thin pale lines against bronze skin, not the kind earned by accident, but by living where the world was rough. His gaze stayed forward, scanning the land as if reading signs only he could see. They passed a meadow where wildflowers clung low to the ground, the kind she'd once picked as a girl to braid into her hair. Now, she only watched them slip by, wondering if she would ever feel light enough to do something so small again. The wind lifted the edge of her skirt, and she caught it quickly, aware of the way his eyes flicked once toward her and then away. When the road dipped into a shallow valley, he slowed the team. The sound of water reached her first, a soft tumbling rush, and then they were crossing a stream no deeper than the horses' ankles. The water flashed silver in the late light, rippling away from the hooves. She bent slightly, catching the scent of it. Cool, clean, nothing like the sour barrels on the train. At the far bank, he stopped the wagon. Without a word, he reached behind them, took up a tin canteen, and held it out. She hesitated, then accepted it, feeling the faint warmth of his hand lingering on the metal. The water was cold and sharp, a taste that filled her chest with something like relief. She passed it back, but he only set it on the seat between them, as if it belonged to neither of them alone now. He climbed down, boots pressing deep into the damp earth, and went to check the wagon's rear wheel. She watched him crouch, the muscles in his back moving with unstudied ease. A man built for labor, she thought, not for talk. He gave the wheel a small shove, then came around to lift her trunk higher in the bed so it wouldn't slide. She realized then he hadn't asked what was inside, hadn't weighed her worth by what she carried. They moved on, the sky deepening to rose. Shadows pooled in the dips of the land, and the wind brought with it the distant cry of a hawk. She drew her shawl tighter, and without glancing at her, he reached back and pulled forward a folded wool blanket, placing it at her side. The gesture was simple, almost careless, but her fingers closed around the edge of it anyway, the texture rough but reassuring. For a time, the rhythm of the wagon became its own kind of conversation. The creak of wood, the steady breath of the horses, the occasional jingle of harness metal. In that quiet, she began to notice small things. The way he shifted the reins gently rather than jerking them, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes from years spent squinting into sunlight, the way he seemed to know when the road would tilt before it did. The hills grew closer, dark with pines that whispered in the wind. The scent of them reached her before the trees themselves, a green, resinous smell that cut through the dry dust of the plains. She thought of the town they'd left, of the women's voices slicing at her back, and felt the distance stretching between herself and that place with each turn of the wheels. When the wagon rattled over a patch of loose stone, she gripped the bench, knuckles tight. His hand came to rest on the side rail near hers, not touching, but close enough she could feel the warmth of it. The horses slowed, finding their footing, and he did not move his hand until the road smoothed again. She found herself wondering about his life before this road. Who had sat beside him on this bench, if anyone, whether he had once been the one left waiting, or if he'd always been the one to arrive. The questions rose but caught in her throat. She suspected he wouldn't answer, not yet. The sun slipped lower, catching the edges of the clouds in amber. They passed a lone cottonwood, its leaves turning silver in the breeze, and a bird rose from its branches, calling once before disappearing into the distance. She followed it with her eyes, then glanced at him again. He was watching the bird too, his face unreadable. "You always travel this road?" she asked at last, her voice softer than she intended. His eyes shifted to her, dark and steady. "Enough to know where it ends." "And where is that?" He didn't answer right away. The wagon creaked, the horses' hooves thudded against the earth. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Home." The word settled in her chest, heavy with meaning she couldn't yet unpack. They rode on, the air cooling with each mile. She drew the blanket higher, and this time he noticed. "Cold?" he asked, the first question he'd given her. "A little." He nodded, flicked the reins gently, and the horses picked up pace, their breath steaming faintly in the dusk. The last light painted the hills in long shadows. She could just make out the outline of a ridge ahead, beyond which the road disappeared entirely. A faint unease stirred in her, not from fear of him, but from stepping into a life she could not yet see. She looked back once, but the horizon behind them was already dark, the station and its whispers swallowed by distance. The wagon crested the rise. Below lay a valley shrouded in blue shadow, the kind that deepens just before night fully takes hold. Somewhere in that valley, a shape moved, too far to make out, but enough for him to lift his chin toward it, his gaze fixed. "We're close," he said quietly, as if the valley itself might be listening. She followed his eyes into the dark, her pulse quickening. The road narrowed, bending toward the unseen. She didn't know what waited there, shelter or silence, judgment or peace, but the way he held the reins told her he intended to see her through to it. The horses' hooves struck the first stones of the descent, and the air grew cooler still. Somewhere beyond the bend, a faint light flickered, like a candle in a window. She leaned forward, trying to see it better, but the wagon tilted into shadow, and the light vanished from view. The wagon slowed as the valley floor leveled, the road narrowing into a track bordered by knee-high grass. In the deepening blue of evening, a low cabin took shape ahead, a simple structure of hand-hewn logs, roof darkened by years of weather. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney, dissolving into the still air. No fence, no gate, only the quiet authority of a place kept not for show but for living. He drew the horses to a halt a few yards from the porch. The sound of their breathing mingled with the faint rustle of wind through the grass. She waited for him to say something, but he climbed down without a word, boots striking the packed earth with a hollow thud. When he reached for her trunk, she stepped down on her own, feeling the ground's firmness after hours of being carried. Up close, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. The porch boards were worn smooth where footsteps had passed countless times. He set her trunk beside the door and pushed it open, letting her enter first. The inside was warmer than she expected, the air steeped in the scent of cooked beans and the sharp green of drying herbs that hung from the rafters. Shadows trembled across the pine walls, cast by a single oil lamp on the table. There were no frills, only what was needed. A long table with 2 chairs, a small bed tucked in one corner, another narrower bed against the opposite wall, shelves holding crockery, a fire smoldering in the stone hearth. He stepped inside and closed the door, the latch clicking softly. Then, without looking at her, he crossed to the hearth, lifted the lid from a blackened pot, and stirred the beans with a wooden spoon. The sound of the spoon scraping the bottom was loud in the silence. She set her bag on the smaller bed, fingers brushing the coarse wool of the blanket folded at its foot. The mattress sagged slightly beneath her hand, but it was clean. The bed was hers, she guessed, though no one had said it. When she turned back, he was ladling beans into a shallow bowl. He placed it on the table and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, then took the chair nearest her bed. He sat opposite, eating without hurry, the muscles in his forearms shifting as he lifted the spoon. She tasted the beans. They were plain but hot, the warmth spreading through her chest. Halfway through the meal, he pushed his bowl toward her, still half full. She started to refuse, then caught the look in his eyes. Not insistence, not pity, just an offer. She took it. He rose and set another log on the fire, the orange glow brightening the room. Later, when she moved to clear the bowls, he shook his head, took them from her hands, and rinsed them in a basin by the wall. She noticed how deliberate his movements were, as if each action had a place and time. Night settled fully, the windows turning black. She sat on the edge of her bed, the fire's heat reaching her in waves. He pulled a shawl from a hook and set it on the foot of her bed before extinguishing the lamp. In the dim firelight, his shadow moved toward his own bed. The sounds of the cabin at night were few. The pop of sap in the logs, the occasional creak of wood as it cooled, the steady rhythm of his breathing across the room. She lay awake longer than she meant to, tracing the lines of the ceiling in the glow. Morning came with the pale wash of dawn through the small east window. She rose quietly, unsure if she should wait or move about. But he was already gone, the door left ajar. Outside, the air was sharp with early chill. She found him near the corral, checking the horses' hooves. He glanced up once, gave a brief nod, and went back to his work. Over the next days, a rhythm began to form. He worked the land, mending a section of fence, hauling water from the creek, tending to the small garden near the porch. She swept the cabin, washed the crockery, began baking bread in the cast-iron pan she found on the hearth. They spoke little, but there were moments when words weren't needed. A loaf set cooling on the table just as he came in from the fields, a bucket left full by the door on mornings when she rose early. Once, while hanging laundry, she saw him watching from the porch. Not long, just enough for her to feel it. She didn't look away. In the evenings, he sometimes carved wood by the fire, the small curls falling into his lap. She would mend the hem of her dress or shell beans into a tin bowl. The silence was no longer empty. It had weight, but it was shared. On the 4th day, rain swept in sudden and heavy, drumming on the roof. The wind drove it against the walls, and a faint leak darkened the plank floor near the door. Without speaking, they worked together to move her bed a few inches from the damp, the task done in near darkness except for the fire's flicker. Their hands brushed once as they lifted, and she felt the warmth of his skin through the briefest contact. That night she dreamed of the station again, the whispering women, the emptiness of the platform, but the dream shifted, and the cabin's fire replaced the sunlit boards. She woke to the sound of rain easing and the steady breathing across the room. By the end of the week, she noticed the cabin had begun to carry her scent. The faint flour dust smell of bread, the lavender soap from her small cloth bag. He noticed too, she thought, though he said nothing. On the 7th evening, he came in later than usual, a thin scratch along his arm. She rose to fetch water and a clean cloth, but he waved her off, tending it himself. Still, she left a piece of bread and a mug of coffee on the table for him. He ate both before saying quietly, "You work hard." The words startled her, not their content, but the fact that he had chosen to speak them. She only nodded. The next morning, he left a small woven pouch on her bed. Inside were a handful of berries, dark and sweet. She found herself smiling without meaning to. She began to understand that his kindness was not loud. It was the kind that came without announcement, without the need to be witnessed. That was perhaps why it unsettled her, because it asked nothing in return. One evening, as the sun lowered and lit the cabin walls with a golden wash, she found herself standing in the doorway, watching him in the yard. He was splitting logs, the axe rising and falling in a measured rhythm. For a moment, the world seemed narrowed to that sound, the scent of pine, and the space between them. She realized then that she no longer thought of leaving. When the last log was stacked, he turned toward her. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze held hers longer than usual. He stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag, and paused as though he might say something. Instead, he reached past her into the cabin, and took the empty coffee pot from the table. "Tomorrow," he said simply, "we'll go to town." The word settled in the air, heavier than its size should allow. She thought of the whispers, the stares, the weight of eyes on her back. The safety of the cabin felt fragile suddenly, as if it could be pierced by something sharp and unseen. He met her gaze for one last moment before stepping outside to pour out the dregs. She stood in the doorway, the golden light fading, her hands curled into the fabric of her skirt. Tomorrow, the world would see them together. Morning came soft and pale, the light spilling through the small east window and catching in the dust motes that drifted above the cabin floor. She rose early, her hands unsteady as she smoothed the skirt of the best dress she owned. It was clean now, the hem mended, the faded ribbon pressed flat with her palms. The air inside the cabin smelled faintly of bread from last night's baking, but beneath it, she could taste the tang of unease. He was already outside, hitching the horses. The creak of leather and the low murmur he gave the animals carried into the doorway. She stepped out, drawing her shawl around her shoulders against the cool edge of morning. He looked at her once, just a single glance from under the dark fall of his hair, and gave a short nod. They set out in silence, the wagon rolling steady over the track. The valley opened into flatter land, and the wind met them head-on, lifting strands of her hair loose from the pins. The scent of the town reached her before she saw it. Coal smoke, horse sweat, the sharp tang of iron from the blacksmith's forge. The first rooftops appeared, then the line of the main street, a spine of wooden buildings with hitch rails out front. People moved along the boardwalks, their voices and footsteps echoing off the false fronts. The moment they turned onto the street, the noise thinned, as though someone had drawn a curtain across the sound. She felt it first as a shift in the air, then in the weight of eyes. Men at the feed store door paused mid-sentence. Women with market baskets slowed their walk, glancing sidelong before whispering behind gloved hands. The blacksmith's hammer stilled for a heartbeat before resuming, each strike ringing sharper than the last. She sat straighter, her hands folded tight in her lap. The horse's hooves clopped against the packed earth, the sound loud in the hush. Beside her, he kept his gaze forward, his grip on the reins loose but firm, as if the stairs of the town could not touch him. They stopped at the general store. He climbed down first, tying the horses to the rail. When he turned to offer his hand, she hesitated for half a breath before taking it, the warmth of his palm grounding her. Inside, the store smelled of dry goods and coffee grounds. Barrels of flour and sugar stood against the walls, shelves stacked with tins and bolts of cloth. The clerk behind the counter, an older man with narrow eyes, looked from her to the man beside her, then down at the list she carried. She read off the first item, her voice steady though her throat felt tight. The clerk fetched it, setting the paper-wrapped bundle on the counter without meeting her eyes. When she offered coins for the next item, he hesitated, his hand still on the counter. The pause was slight but sharp enough to cut. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks. Without a word, the man beside her reached forward, took the coins from her hand, and placed them on the counter himself. The sound of metal on wood was louder than it needed to be. The clerk took them then, his mouth tightening before he turned away. They finished the list in silence. She gathered the smaller parcels into her arms, but he took them from her, stacking them in the crook of one arm while holding the larger sack in the other. His presence filled the narrow aisle, leaving little room for the whispers that still threaded through the air. Outside, the sunlight was harsher. A pair of boys sat on the edge of the boardwalk, their boots dangling. One nudged the other and muttered something she couldn't catch, though the grin that followed told enough. She kept her eyes on the wagon, her steps measured. Once they were on the road out of town, the sounds of it faded, replaced by the steady creak of the wagon and the clink of the harness. She released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "You don't have to come with me next time," she said quietly, her eyes on the horizon. He didn't answer at once. The horses shifted, tossing their heads at a fly. Finally he said, "Yes, I do." The words were simple, spoken without emphasis, but they left no space for argument. They rode on, the land stretching back into the wide calm of the valley. When they reached the cabin, he unloaded the parcels onto the table while she lit the lamp. The warmth of the fire and the smell of home wrapped around her like a cloak, but the sting of the town lingered, sharp as the memory of a slap. That night, she sat on the porch steps after the dishes were done, watching the dark press against the yard. The air was cool, the stars beginning to show in the east. She heard the door open behind her, his steps slow across the boards. He didn't sit right away, just stood near the railing, looking out into the dark as she did. Then he set a mug of coffee beside her, and lowered himself onto the step above. Neither of them spoke for a while. The crickets filled the quiet, their song weaving through the rustle of the grass. She sipped the coffee, the bitterness grounding her. "Why does it bother them?" she asked at last, her voice low. He didn't look at her. "They see what they don't understand. And what they fear, they talk about." She turned that over, the steam from the mug rising into the cool air. "It's hard to carry it." His shoulders shifted slightly, as though he'd thought of touching her but decided against it. "You don't carry it alone." The words settled into her chest, warm and heavy. Later, when she went inside, the table was clear, the parcels stowed neatly away. He had left the lamp burning low, its light casting long, soft shadows along the walls. She stood in that light for a long moment before moving to her bed. The next morning, the rhythm of the cabin returned. The fire lit before dawn, the smell of bread, the sound of him outside with the horses. But when she thought of the town, the sting came less from their judgment and more from the knowledge that she had faced it with him. As the week wore on, the weight of those eyes didn't vanish, but it no longer bent her posture. She found herself walking outside more, pausing on the porch to watch him work. Once, she caught him glancing up, meeting her gaze with something almost like approval. One evening, as they shared a quiet meal, he said, "We'll have to go back soon." She looked up from her plate, feeling the old tightness in her chest. But this time, it was tempered by something steadier. She nodded once. He studied her for a moment longer, then returned to his food, as if the matter were decided. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. She rose to close the shutters, and when she turned back he was watching her, not with scrutiny, but with the same quiet patience he had shown the day he found her at the station. It struck her then that the town's eyes might never soften, but his already had. Later, as the rain began to patter against the roof, he set down his carving and said, almost as if to himself, "You belong here." The words hung in the warm air between them, and she felt the truth of them settle deep, even as she wondered what belonging would cost her in the eyes of the world. The day had been unusually still, the air holding that brittle quiet that comes before something breaks. She had spent the afternoon sweeping the porch, shaking out the rugs, and setting a loaf of bread to rise by the fire. He had been in the yard splitting wood, the steady crack of the axe marking the hours. It was the kind of rhythm that had begun to feel like safety, quiet, simple, unbroken. By late afternoon, the sun sank lower, spilling amber light across the valley. She was on the porch, brushing flour from her hands, when she saw the dust cloud on the road. At first, she thought it was wind lifting dirt from the trail, but then the shape of a rider came into view, swaying slightly in the saddle. The horse was thin, ribs showing, its gait uneven. The man on its back sat with the careless posture of someone who didn't care if he arrived in one piece. He slowed as he neared the cabin, his eyes finding her first before sliding toward the man by the woodpile. A crooked grin cut across his face, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "There she is," he called, his voice carrying like a knife in still air. "Didn't think you'd run far enough I couldn't find you." Her fingers tightened on the railing. The sound of that voice reached somewhere deep, where old fear lived. She stepped back instinctively, the boards creaking under her weight. The Comanche set down his axe without hurry, but his movements carried a quiet finality. He walked to stand between her and the rider, his body an unspoken barrier. His bare chest glinted in the late light, scars catching the sun, and his eyes were fixed, unblinking. The man in the saddle laughed low. "You think you can keep what isn't yours?" He spat into the dust, the saliva dark on pale dirt. "She came with me once. She'll leave with me again." The Comanche didn't move, didn't speak. His silence filled the space between them, heavy as a held breath. The rider's gaze shifted back to her. Tell him you're coming." Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She thought of the station, the trunk at her feet, the sting of being unwanted. She thought of the town's eyes, sharp with judgment. And she thought of the cabin, the smell of bread, the folded blanket at her side, the way his presence filled the quiet without crowding her. Her voice, when it came, surprised her. "No." The rider blinked, as if the word didn't make sense. "What?" She stepped forward, past the Comanche, though she stayed close enough to feel the heat of him at her side. "This is my home now." The man on the horse's face twisted, something mean sparking in his eyes. "You'll regret it." "I already regretted going with you," she said, her tone low but steady. The Comanche's hand rose slightly, not touching her, but close enough she could feel the weight of it, silent assurance. The rider's gaze darted between them, reading what was unspoken, and for the first time, his smirk faltered. He pulled on the reins, the horse sidestepping uneasily. "You'll see," he muttered, but the edge in his voice had dulled. With a sharp kick, he turned the animal, riding back down the road in a trail of settling dust. They stood watching until the dust faded into the horizon. The light had shifted, turning the valley gold at its edges, but the air still held the echo of what had just passed. She turned to face him, her throat tight. "You didn't have to." His eyes met hers, steady. "Yes, I did." Something in her eased at that. She felt her shoulders lower, as if she'd been holding them up for months without realizing it. They went inside without speaking, the door closing on the fading light. The bread had risen perfectly, its surface rounded and warm. She set it in the oven while he poured water into the basin, washing the day's dust from his hands. The normalcy of it felt almost unreal after the sharpness of the moment outside. When the bread was ready, they ate at the table, the crust still crackling from the heat. Neither of them spoke much, but the quiet was not the same as it had been when they first met. It had weight now and warmth. After the plates were cleared, she stepped outside alone, standing on the porch. The sky was deepening to violet, a single star showing low above the ridge. The grass whispered in the wind, the sound blending with the faint creak of the porch boards as he came to stand beside her. He didn't look at her, just leaned one shoulder against the post. "He won't come back," he said. She believed him. They stayed there until the last light slipped away, the cool air settling around them. She thought of the road ahead, the eyes in town, the whispers that might never stop. But she also thought of the steady rhythm of this place, the way it asked nothing of her except to be here. When they went back inside, the fire was still glowing. She moved to her bed, pausing when she saw something on the folded blanket. A small carved figure, smooth in the places where his hands had shaped it, simple but whole. She looked at him. He had already turned toward his own bed, but there was the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. She held the carving in her palm, feeling the grain of the wood, and for the first time in years, she felt the word settle inside her without resistance. Home.